In Kingman, Arizona, in 1924, a donkey fell asleep in a bathtub. This sounds like the opening line of a bad joke. It is not. What followed the donkey falling asleep in the bathtub was a flood, a genuine flood that swept the bathtub, and the donkey inside it 1 full mile downstream. The rescue operation cost the town a significant amount of time, money, and dignity. The government's response was immediate. They passed a law. To this day, it is technically illegal in Arizona for a donkey to sleep in a bathtub. Now, before you laugh, that law makes complete sense. And that is the point of this entire video. The Old West is famous for its lawlessness. What it is less famous for is the extraordinary, specific, occasionally bewildering body of legislation that frontier communities produced to deal with problems that no one had ever needed to legislate before. Ice cream in pockets, camels on highways, fake mustaches in church, cowboys without cows. Every single one of these laws had a reason. Today we are going to find out what those reasons were. Welcome back to the Weston Archive, where we take the history of the American frontier seriously, even when that history involves a donkey in a bathtub. If you are new here, subscribe now. I want to start with a question right now. Drop your answer in the comments. What is the weirdest law you have ever heard of, from anywhere, any era? Because I have a feeling this video is going to give you some serious competition. Write it down there. I read every single one. There is a persistent myth that the Old West was a place without rules. The reality is the opposite. Frontier communities were obsessed with rules, precisely because the consequences of not having them were immediately visible in ways that older, more established cities could absorb. When your town has no sewage system, one person spitting on the wooden sidewalk can contribute to a tuberculosis outbreak. When your entire economy depends on horses and mules, one panicking animal on Main Street can kill someone. When your town has 100 men, a dozen saloons, and one marshal, you write the rules down very specifically, because you cannot afford to argue about interpretation at 2 in the morning. Frontier law was not abstract. It was reactive. Something happened. People suffered. Someone wrote a law. The stranger the law sounds today, the stranger the original problem must have been. With that framework in mind, let us go through them one by one. The donkey and the bathtub, Arizona. We already covered the origin. A donkey, a bathtub, a flood, a 1-mile involuntary journey, a rescue operation, a law. What makes the Arizona Bathtub Ordinance interesting, beyond its comedy, is what it reveals about how frontier legislation actually worked. There was no theoretical framework here, no committee deliberating over policy. An event happened that cost the community resources it could not afford to waste. The response was direct and specific. Make sure this exact event cannot happen again. The law technically remains on the books. It has never been repealed, because no one has ever felt the urgency of repealing a law about donkeys and bathtubs. The camel problem, Nevada, 1875. This one requires a small history lesson that most people do not know. In the 1850s, the United States Army conducted a formal experiment, importing camels from the Middle East and North Africa to use as pack animals in the American Southwest. The reasoning was sound. Camels can carry heavier loads than mules, travel longer without water, and handle desert terrain better than horses. The experiment failed. Not because of the camels, which performed reasonably well, but because of every other animal they encountered. Horses, mules, and oxen that had never seen a camel reacted to the sight and smell of them with immediate, uncontrollable panic. Pack trains scattered, wagons overturned, animals bolted into traffic and off trails. The damage to property and the risk to human life were significant. When the Army abandoned the camel program after the Civil War, the animals were released or sold off. Some escaped into the wild. Others ended up in the hands of private owners who used them for transport and hauling. By 1875, Nevada had seen enough overturned wagons and panicking horse teams to act. An official ordinance was passed prohibiting the driving of camels on public roads. The law was not absurd. The camels were genuinely a traffic hazard, and everyone in Nevada at the time understood exactly why. The Soap Thief's Sentence. Mojave County, Arizona. Mojave County, Arizona had an unusual approach to soap theft. Anyone caught stealing soap was sentenced to use it, continuously, until the entire bar was gone. This sounds comedic. The logic is actually elegant. Frontier jails were expensive to operate. Feeding a prisoner for days or weeks over a bar of soap was a waste of community resources. The soap sentence served two functions simultaneously. It punished the crime, it cleaned the criminal, and it cost the county nothing. Whether the metaphor of washing away the sin was intentional or accidental is unclear. The cost savings were definitely intentional. A camel traffic law, a donkey bathtub ordinance, and a soap sentence that cleans the criminal. Every one of these has a real story behind it. Did you know any of these? Write it in the comments. And if you are not subscribed yet, now is the time. This is probably the most famous of the frontier's peculiar laws, and also the one with the most satisfying explanation. In Kentucky, Alabama, and several Western territories, it was illegal to carry ice cream in your back pocket. The reason is horse theft. Here is how the scheme worked. A horse thief would place a scoop of ice cream in the back pocket of his trousers. He would then approach a horse tied to a hitching post. The horse, attracted by the smell of the sugar, would follow the man without any force, without a lead rope, without any visible coercion. If the thief was caught, he had a defense. The horse came with me on its own. I did not steal it. It chose to follow me. This was not an easy argument to defeat in a frontier court, where the burden of proof was already complicated and the definition of theft sometimes required demonstrating intent. The ice cream law closed that loophole directly. If you were found with ice cream in your back pocket and a horse nearby that did not belong to you, you had no defense. The ice cream was the intent. The intent was the crime. It is one of the cleverest pieces of frontier legislation on record, a targeted response to a specific criminal technique that had apparently been used successfully enough to require a legal countermeasure. Now consider this. Someone had to steal enough horses this way before lawmakers noticed the pattern, investigated the method, and decided to write the ice cream law. That means this technique worked, repeatedly, which means there were, at some point in American history, professional horse thieves who specifically relied on their back pockets and a scoop of vanilla. Here is the one that is going to genuinely surprise most people who think they know their Old West history. The frontier towns of the American West had some of the strictest gun control laws in the country. In Tombstone, Arizona, in Dodge City, Kansas, in Abilene, Kansas, the ordinances were clear and actively enforced. No person was permitted to carry any deadly weapon within the city limits. When you rode into town, you checked your guns at the marshal's office, at the hotel, or with a designated representative of the law. You received a metal token in exchange. When you left, you got your weapons back. The reality behind the OK Corral. The most famous gunfight in Western history, the confrontation at the OK Corral in Tombstone on October 26, 1881, did not begin as a gunfight. It began as a law enforcement action. Virgil Earp, as city marshal, was attempting to enforce Municipal Ordinance No. 9, the Tombstone City Ordinance requiring visitors to surrender their firearms. The Clanton and McClory cowboys had refused to disarm. Virgil, accompanied by his brothers and Doc Holliday, went to compel compliance. The gunfight was the consequence of that refusal. The entire incident was, legally speaking, a weapons seizure operation that went catastrophically wrong. The Tombstone Paradox. Here is what makes the Tombstone gun laws particularly interesting. The city ordinance requiring the surrender of firearms upon entering town existed simultaneously with a separate ordinance requiring able-bodied male citizens to own a firearm and be available for service in the local militia. You were legally required to own a gun. You were legally prohibited from carrying it in town. The frontier relationship with weapons was not simple. It was not the unregulated free-for-all that a century of Westerns has suggested. It was a negotiated, locally specific, constantly evolving set of rules that different communities applied differently based on their particular problems. The OK Corral shootout started as a gun control enforcement action. Did you know that? Write it in the comments. This is the kind of detail that rewrites everything you thought you knew. This is the Western Archive. Frontier towns needed two things to survive long-term: economic activity, which meant attracting rough, mobile working men, and long-term settlement, which meant attracting families, investors, and churches. These two populations had radically different expectations for what a town should look like. The solution was a category of legislation known as blue laws, moral ordinances designed to demonstrate that a frontier settlement was a place of civilization, not chaos. They did not always work. They were sometimes immediately ignored, but they were written down, which was itself a statement of intent. The Ice Cream Sundae, Evanston, Wyoming. In Evanston, Wyoming, it was illegal to sell ice cream soda on Sundays. The reasoning was straightforwardly religious. The carbonated beverage was considered too festive, too indulgent, too pleasurable for the Sabbath. Soda water was, in the moral framework of the time, a sin water. The shop owner's response was the birth of one of the most enduring American food traditions. To keep selling a version of their product without the illegal bubbles, owners began serving ice cream with syrup only. No soda, no carbonation. They called it an ice cream sundae, named for the day on which it was legally permissible. Over time, the spelling changed to Sunday, partly to make it sound less like the Sabbath, and partly to make it sound like something that could be sold any day of the week. The ice cream sundae exists because a frontier town in Wyoming decided that fizzy drinks were sinful on Sundays, and a shop owner decided to find a workaround. Mustaches in church. Tombstone, Arizona. Some Tombstone churches prohibited men with mustaches from attending services. This was not vanity legislation. In that era and that community, a mustache on a man's face carried specific social meaning. Gamblers wore mustaches. Outlaws wore mustaches. Men whose occupations placed them outside the moral economy of the community wore mustaches. The church's restriction was a statement about who belonged in that space. It was also, in a town where the line between respectable citizen and dangerous criminal was genuinely unclear, a practical tool for managing who was allowed inside a building full of unarmed people. Fake mustaches in church, Alabama. Alabama went one step further. There, it was illegal to wear a fake mustache in church if it caused laughter among the congregation. This is less strange than it appears. The church in frontier communities was not merely a religious institution. It was a civic center, a social anchor, and one of the primary mechanisms through which a community performed its own respectability to itself. Disrupting a service, even through something as seemingly minor as a comedic disguise, was treated as a serious act of social sabotage. The fake mustache law was a misdemeanor. It carried a fine. It was enforced. Someone, somewhere, was fined for making a congregation laugh in church, and that fine was paid. The Midnight Dance Curfew, Abilene, Kansas. Abilene, Kansas, home at various points to Wild Bill Hickok as marshal, prohibited public dancing after midnight. This was not prudishness, it was a practical management tool. After midnight in a frontier cattle town, the men still dancing were the men who had been drinking the longest. The marshal's ability to keep a room under control decreases as the night extends and the alcohol accumulates. A hard cutoff on dancing was, in effect, a hard cutoff on the conditions most likely to produce violence. Wild Bill Hickok understood this. He enforced it. Women in saloons. Dodge City. In Dodge City, women were prohibited from entering saloons, with a specific exception for women who worked there. The ordinance was not about protecting women's virtue in any simple sense. It was a zoning law. The saloon was designated space for one type of activity. The rest of town was designated for another. The prohibition maintained a visible separation between the economic categories of women in the community. Whether it achieved its stated goal is a different question. Whether the women it was meant to protect wanted that protection is another. But the ordinance had a logic, and that logic was municipal rather than moral, even if it was written in moral language. Frontier communities used clothing as a legal category in ways that modern readers find genuinely startling. The reason is that in a highly mobile population, where strangers arrived constantly and no one could verify who anyone was, what a person wore was one of the only readable signals of their identity and intention. No cowboy boots without cows. Blythe, California. In Blythe, California, it was illegal to wear cowboy boots unless you owned at least 2 cows. This sounds absurd until you understand what cowboy boots actually were. They were not a fashion item. They were specialized professional equipment. High heels designed to prevent a foot from sliding through a stirrup, tall shafts to protect the leg while riding through brush, pointed toes to hook quickly into a stirrup in an emergency. They were expensive. They were specific. They were the gear of someone who worked on horseback with cattle. The word cowboy itself, at this time, was not a heroic title. In many parts of the West, cowboy was a synonym for troublemaker, rustler, or outlaw. Legitimate working ranchers called themselves cattle herders or ranchers. Cowboys were the dangerous ones. A law restricting the wearing of cowboy boots to actual cattle owners served multiple purposes at once. It made it easier to identify who was a legitimate working rancher and who was performing the identity without the substance. It created a visible marker of social standing, and it gave law enforcement a simple, observable reason to question a stranger wearing expensive professional gear who appeared to have no professional reason to be wearing it. Requiring ownership of 2 cows rather than 1 was also specific. 1 cow might be an accident, a single purchase, a prop. 2 cows suggested a minimum operation, an actual attempt at ranching. The threshold was low, but it was real. One more thing worth noting. The image of the cowboy in boots and a wide-brimmed hat is largely a Hollywood invention. In the actual 19th century frontier, many working men preferred the bowler hat. Practical, durable, and widely available. High cowboy boots were expensive and uncomfortable off a horse. Most people did not wear them unless they needed to. We have talked in previous episodes about disease on the frontier. The saloon's common towel, the shared toothbrush, the sawdust floor full of bacteria. The sanitation laws of frontier towns were a direct legislative response to these conditions. Attempts to impose order on environments where the cost of epidemic disease was visible and immediate. No bathing in livestock troughs. Deadwood, South Dakota. In Deadwood, South Dakota, bathing in public livestock water troughs was a finable offense. This was not about modesty. Livestock water was a shared economic resource. A person bathing in it introduced soap, skin, and biological material into the water supply that the horses, mules, and cattle of the entire community depended on. Sick animals meant a failing economy. The fine was an investment protection measure. No spitting on the sidewalk. Cheyenne, Wyoming. Cheyenne, Wyoming prohibited spitting on sidewalks. The sidewalks were wooden. Wooden sidewalks accumulated material in their gaps and surfaces and were difficult to clean. Chewing tobacco was universal on the frontier. The combination produced sidewalks saturated with tobacco juice, which created a documented pathway for tuberculosis transmission. The spitting ban was a public health ordinance written in an era before the germ theory of disease was widely understood or accepted, which makes it, in retrospect, remarkably effective public health policy arrived at through observation rather than microbiology. No swearing in public. Deadwood, South Dakota. Deadwood also fined residents for swearing in public. Deadwood, it should be noted, was one of the most genuinely lawless and violent settlements in the history of the American frontier. The swearing ordinance was aspirational legislation, a statement that the community wanted to be the kind of place that had such a rule, regardless of whether anyone was going to follow it. Sometimes frontier law was not about controlling behavior, it was about projecting an identity. And there is something genuinely human about a mining town full of armed prospectors passing an ordinance against bad language because they wanted, on some level, to be somewhere better than where they were. The laws of the Old West look absurd from a distance. Up close, they are something else entirely. They are the record of real problems that real people faced in real time, with no precedent to guide them, no established institutions to fall back on, and no option to wait for a better solution to arrive. The donkey bathtub law exists because a donkey almost drowned and cost the town money. The ice cream law exists because horse thieves were clever. The camel law exists because the United States Army imported camels to Arizona and then released them onto Nevada highways. The sundae exists because someone in Wyoming decided that fizzy drinks were sinful on Sundays. Every strange law in this video is a small window into a specific moment of frontier life. A moment when the community looked at its situation and said, "We cannot let this happen again." That impulse, to look at chaos and reach for a rule, is not uniquely Western. It is not uniquely American. It is one of the most basic things human communities do. The frontier just did it faster, with less paper, and occasionally with significantly more donkeys involved. Which of these laws surprised you most? The ice cream horse theft technique? The OK Corral as a gun control story? The birth of the sundae, or the cowboy boots ordinance? Tell me in the comments. And if you found something genuinely new in this video, share it. That is how this channel grows. Subscribe if you have not already. We will see you in the next one. Stay curious.